Secretariat was only 19 years old when he died, but before he died, he produced about 600 foals. And one of them, Risen Star, probably should have won the Triple Crown in 1988. He was very good. He lost the Derby. He had a terrible trip and got blocked here, couldn't get any running room, and finished third to Winning Colors. But he was a really good racehorse and 3-year-old champion. And his daughter, Lady Secret, was a horse of the year in the middle of the 1980s. She was a brilliant mare, one of the greatest female racehorses that ever lived. And he produced her. His broodmares, his daughters, were exceptional producers. And in fact, the two greatest stallions in America over the last 20 years have been Stormcat and AP Indy. And both Stormcat and AP Indy were out of daughters of Secretariat. And so his name has been passed on through generations after generation since then of horses that have been produced in America and around the world. So his name figures very prominently in pedigrees of the best horses racing today. And he never, like every single great racehorse I've ever heard of, Man o' War, Count Fleet, Citation, Seattle Slew, Affirmed, Alydar, they never produced a horse equal to their own greatness. And Secretariat never did either. He never reproduced himself. No truly great racehorse ever really reproduces himself. If it happens, it's been very rare and unusual. I guess Eclipse did it back in the 18th century, but in modern times, I've never seen it happen. And so it was, so it's no surprise that he didn't produce another Secretariat, but he contracted. He got very large as a stud horse. He was 1,200 pounds, 1,300. And he got very heavy, and he developed laminitis when he was on Labor Day of 1989, when he was 19 years old. And they thought they had it under control, but what happened was it came back a month later. I happened to be down in Kentucky, and he developed laminitis again. And when I came down there to do a story totally unrelated to Secretariat, I was at Claiborne Farm, and when I walked in the door that day, I had seen him earlier in the day from afar. I had seen him in a in a paddock being held by his groom, Bobby Anderson. And I thought to myself, why is Bobby sitting on that bucket in the sun and holding on to that horse? Why isn't the horse loose in the paddock like everybody else? He looked very good from 100 yards away is where I saw him. But he didn't look like he quite had the bulk he used to have. He looked like he had lost some weight. But I didn't think too much of it. Now, about half an hour later, when I got back to the front gate at Claiborne, I walked inside, and secretaries were crying at their desks. And I thought, what's going on around here? Why is everybody so weepy and sad? And so I went in to see the farm manager, John Sosby, and he said, why are you here? Are you here for Secretariat? And I said, no. Should I be? And he said, well, the horse is very sick, we could lose him. And I said, what's wrong with him? He said, he has laminitis. He had it a month ago. We thought we had it under control, and it just broke out again yesterday. And he's in very bad pain, and we might have to put him down. And I said, oh, no. And so I went in and I did my interviewing with Seth Hancock, who had syndicated him back when he was a 3-year-old, and he'd been at the farm, and he said, we might lose him. And I said, how long does he have? And he said, maybe 2 weeks. And I said, oh my goodness. So I left, and I said, if there's any developments, I told him what hotel I was staying at. And that day I got back to the hotel, and there was a telephone call for me saying that they were going to have to put him down. And it was a very tough time for me. I wasn't really ready for it. He meant a lot to me emotionally. He represented not just perfection in an equine athlete, but he also represented a time in my life that was very happy. I had young children. I was married, and it was a good time in my life. I'd written a book about him, and a lot of good memories I associated with him. And he was like a member of the family. My kids regarded him as sort of the fifth child that was off at school while I was doing the book, and they'd ask about him. How's Secretariat doing? He was like a kid, and he was like one of the kids. I had 4 children. He was like the fifth one. And so I was close to him. My kids were close to him. My wife would ask about him. Mary, she'd say, how's he doing? and now suddenly he was gone, and it was very hard, and and then they buried him whole, instead of burying just vital parts of him like the hooves and the head and the testicles. That's what they normally bury with a horse, but this one they buried him whole, which is very few horses are so honored. Man o' War was buried whole back in when he died in 1947 or 48. They actually had a funeral for him. Well, this horse, they had a graveside service for him, and they lowered him into the ground. And by the way, when he died, they took him in to have an autopsy done. And when Dr. Thomas Swerzik at the University of Kentucky cut him open and took out his heart, he discovered that he had his heart was over twice as large, almost twice as large as the average heart, a third larger at least. The average horse's heart is 9 pounds. The average size of the heart of a performance horse, a racehorse, or a harness horse is 12 pounds. And the average size of, that was the average size of a performance is 12. His was 18 to 20 pounds. So Secretariat had a heart that was more than a third larger than the average equine heart, and it was not pathologically enlarged. All of the valves in the chambers were normal. It was just bigger. He inherited that probably from a mare that lived in the early 19th century, in the 1830s, named Pocahontas in Britain. She had gone through some kind of Darwinian mutation, and would started passing along a chromosome to her female offspring that became known as the X chromosome. And the X chromosome is called the large heart chromosome in a horse. And Secretariat's mother, Something Royal, was a descendant of Pocahontas, and she passed along the X chromosome to Secretariat, and that was the reason why he had such a huge heart. And in any event, that was the end of him. And he gets flowers almost every day at his grave ever since. Roses, tulips. There's always a garland. There's always a dozen roses on his grave. When Diane Lane was making the movie Secretariat last fall, she came out to see his grave, and I happened to be out there, and I greeted her out there. We had met earlier, and she looked at the gravestone, and she looked at the graves of his daddy, Bold Ruler, and the other horses. And then as she started to leave, I noticed that there was a dozen roses in a pot, in a vase on Secretariat's grave. And so I went out and I plucked a red rose, and I walked over to Diane and I said, "Here, Secretariat would like you to have this." And she took the rose and she touched it to her cheek like an artist's brush, and said, "I will treasure this always." And that little anecdote I told in the introduction to my new edition of the Secretariat book, and it was a very sweet moment. And anyway, she remembers it very vividly, and it was very nice.